Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. We are back to estate planning of the rich and famous, where we chat about celebrities and their estate planning. Today's episode is on the lovely Betty White, an absolute icon, am I right? Most known for playing Rose on The Golden Girls, Betty was also very well known for appearing on The Mary Tyler Moore Show and several game shows such as Password, Match Game, $25,000 Pyramid, and a little side note about your host here. Is anyone else a sucker for old game shows like that? Oh my goodness, I am. And it is not uncommon for my husband Justin and I to watch those game shows on Game Show Network. Who knew that they still played those? So if you recall, we at Legal Tea did an episode on the hashtag Betty White challenge that happened after her passing to raise money for animal shelters and rescues, but we've not done an episode on here for her estate and her estate plan. So here we are. As always, let's talk a little bit about Betty personally speaking, like family and marriage, etc., before we dive into her estate and what happened following her passing. So according to her Wikipedia page, after growing up in Illinois, another Midwesterner, and remember, one of the last estate planning of the Rich and Famous episodes we did was on Tony Hsieh, and he was a Midwesterner too. So Betty's mother, father, and Betty herself, and she was an only child, moved to California when Betty was just 1 year old. And that was during the Great Depression. From there, they stayed in California, and that's where Betty grew up. She graduated high school in 1939, and 2 years later, the United States entered World War II in 1941. Betty, while volunteering with the American Women's Voluntary Services, met her first husband, Dick Barker. Dick was in the Army as a pilot, and after the war, they got married and began residing in Ohio. Shortly after moving to Ohio, Betty seemed to not really enjoy the Midwest life, so they moved back to California. And after a year or so after they returned to California, Betty and Dick got divorced. A few years later, in 1947, Betty married a gentleman by the name of Lane Allen, who was a talent agent. Though a mere 2 years after their marriage, they got divorced in 1949. Supposedly, Lane wanted a family, but she did not. Finally, in 1963, Betty married Alan Ludden, who as soon as I saw his picture, I was like, wait, that's the host of Password. I told you I watched these silly game shows. So Betty and Alan met on Password when Betty appeared as a celebrity guest in 1961. 20 years later, in 1981, Alan sadly passed away from stomach cancer. While he and Betty never had any children together, Alan did have 3 children prior to his marriage to Betty. Their names were David, Martha, and Sarah. Following Alan's passing, Betty went on to continue to live a long, happy life. After all, Betty, who lived to be 99 years old, was only 60 years old when Alan passed away. So nearly 40 years later is when Alan had passed away. Betty, tragically, passed away on the morning of December 31st, 2021. She died in her sleep from a stroke she had on Christmas Day. Estate planning-wise, things have been rather quiet, which anyone in this estate industry knows is a good sign. It's been a few months since she passed away, and her final wishes, like estate wishes, are not plastered all over the news. That is very, very likely means that she had a well-crafted estate plan. Along those lines, let's chat about what we do know. As we sit here today in April 2022, 4 months after Betty White passed away, it is likely that if Betty did not have a last will and testament, or just had a last will and testament, her estate would be going through probate. When things go through probate, things get filed with the court, and that's when we start hearing mumblings, about a celebrity's estate. Here with Betty, it's been sort of crickets. A lot of nothing. No talk of probate, really no talk of a will. But there has been talk of a trust, and we know that because a living trust, and we know that because property records are public record. And it's been determined that one of Betty White's real estate properties is held in a living trust. According to a blog by Antonopoulos and Associates, a law firm out of Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., Betty owned a mansion in Brentwood, California. It is said to be worth approximately $5 million. The blog shared that Betty purchased the house around 20 years ago and did so under the name of her trust. That's really why people are saying that, that she had some sort of estate plan and it consisted of a trust. The beautiful thing about a trust is that so long as it is funded appropriately, meaning assets are held in the name of the trust, the administration of the assets following the person's passing remains private. Oftentimes, it requires absolutely no court or probate involvement. Within an article on Benzinga, an estate planning attorney out of San Diego, California, named Rodney Hatley, was interviewed about Betty's passing and the estate planning that she likely had. He mentioned something that I'm going to directly quote from him because it summarizes estate planning, especially regarding probate avoidance, so well. He said, quote, "Because Betty White's home was owned by a trust, it will avoid probate, which is expensive, public, and time-consuming. If Betty had only had a will or no plan at all, then the probate fees for her home would have been $126,000 or 3% of the value of that asset. Betty received good advice from her estate planning attorney and saved her estate hundreds of thousands of dollars," end quote. He's not wrong. Probate is definitely a thing that can get very expensive very quickly. That $126,000 in probate fees that he references, that is only 3% of the house only. That doesn't even count all of her assets, which is crazy. To give an idea of how much we're talking about with Betty's estate, the consensus among different sources is that Betty's estate is said to be worth around $75 million. So if we stick with Rodney Hatley's estimate of probate fees being around 3%, the probate fees, had Betty not done proper estate planning with the trust to avoid probate, her probate fees for assets around $75 million would have been around $2.25 million. To be frank, 3% is real. Rodney Hatley is definitely not out of line with his estimate of 3%. I often tell my own clients, that probate legal fees around here in Indiana are usually between 2 to 4%, but I've seen as much as 6%. So utilizing 3% is definitely not out of line. And actually, 3% is more in the middle. It could be a touch less, of course, but it could be more. In addition to the Brentwood, California house, Betty also had a house in Carmel, California. According to an article by Dan Avery on Architectural Digest website, Betty spent her final years in the house in Brentwood that we talked about a second ago. But this Carmel house was supposedly her favorite. According to a source who told the New York Post, quote, "If she had it her way, Betty would have lived and died in that house in Carmel. It's the home she shared with her late husband. It's where she felt more comfortable," end quote. Quite simply, as Betty aged, the Brentwood house was just easier to access and move around for Betty than the Carmel house. According to Dan Avery's article on Architectural Digest, which was released on March 30th, 2022, so it's a very recent article, that house is actually now for sale and is for sale for $7.95 million. So if you're a nerd like me, I totally found the real estate listing, and there's a direct link in the source links for this episode if you care to check it out. And no, it's the last link on that source on the source links for this episode. The house is a beauty. Beyond the question of what is in Betty's estate, another big question that again has so far remained private, and part of the benefit of a trust, is who gets Betty's estate? It could merely be a guessing game. While she had no children of her own, it is said that she probably left something, but not all of it, to her late husband's children, David, Martha, and Sarah. Though, as we discussed on Legal Tea episode number 31, where we talked about the hashtag Betty White challenge that occurred following her passing, Betty was a huge lover of animals and an advocate for them. So it's likely that under Betty's estate planning, mysterious estate plan, that perhaps she also contributed to animal advocacy organizations as well. So what are the takeaways from Betty's estate planning? To me, I think one big takeaway is the privacy. I searched and searched and searched for some concrete information on Betty's estate plan, as in who gets what, who's in charge, etc. And there's very little information out there. That is the beautiful thing about 1, doing an estate plan, and 2, doing a thorough estate plan. Things can remain private, so long as you put the time, money, and energy into good planning. We should have all known that with everyone's favorite grandma, Betty White, she would not have let us down with some bad planning. We should have known Betty would have done good estate planning. I often hear from my own clients and prospective clients, Jenny, do we need a trust? Do we even have enough assets for a trust? And I always answer the same way. First, trusts are not just for the wealthy. I help a lot of clients get trusts in place, and most of my clients are just everyday people. Instead of how much in assets, I always focus on what the client's goal is. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. For example, are you trying to just do the bare minimum, trying to get the bare minimum done right now just to get something in place? Well, maybe a trust is not needed. Or are you trying to avoid probate? Or are you trying to provide a very specific distribution pattern, like based on age for beneficiaries? Or are you trying to gain asset protection? If any of those are a yes, maybe a trust does make sense. So it's very goal dependent rather than how many assets you have. Another big takeaway from Betty White's estate planning is that I think it's safe to say that Betty had a trust, right? Property records are public record, and you can't hide things since it's public record. It sounds like it's been confirmed that her real estate properties are or were in a trust. So the big takeaway with this piece is that with a trust, you not only have to have the trust prepared and signed, but there's a process that happens after you sign the document called funding. The funding of a trust means you are proactively getting assets into the name of the trust, as in the trust will own the asset, or possibly make the trust the beneficiary. The funding process honestly puts the bow on top. Without the trust funding, it is a pile of paper. So if you have a trust, or if you want a trust, be sure to get the thing funded. Any solid estate planning attorney can help with that, I promise. Okay, let's wrap this episode up. Next week, we are back to a cautionary tale episode where we talk about real-life clients of mine, real-life cases, not celebrity level cases that I or my office have personally worked on. So yeah, tune in for that next Tuesday, Legal Tea listeners. Until then, take care and be well.